Welcome! Today we're talking about the similarities and differences between watercolor, acrylic, and oil paint. Watercolor comes in both tube and pan form and are used on top of watercolor paper, a thick paper used to support the weight of water. Acrylic and oil paints are frequently used on canvas, which is a tightly woven cloth stretched over a wooden frame. All right, let's talk more in depth about watercolor paint. So in my setup, I have a piece of watercolor paper, a cup of water, a brush, and a paper towel. First, I'm going to take a little of that tube watercolor paint and I'm going to squeeze it into the lid of my tray. And the tube is just concentrated watercolor paint with a little water mixed in. And to use it, I'm going to get my paintbrush wet with clean water and use that to dilute that concentration and pick up some of the paint on the toe of the brush. And as I apply this to the paper, it's going to make a nice bold mark. And let's try the same with the pan watercolor. Again, wet the paintbrush, swirl it around the paint, and it's going to give very similar results. Now the key to working with watercolors is you have to control the water, because wherever the water is, the paint wants to flow. So I'm going to make a little square of just water to demonstrate this. And see when I draw that paintbrush streak, how it just instantly spreads out amongst that wet part of the paper. So beginners find this very difficult to control, but as long as you can control where the water is, you can learn to control the paint. Another tip is you have to be patient. If you paint wet things next to wet things, they're going to do something called bleed, which is when one color seeps into another color that's not yet dry. So I've painted a little kind of orange-yellow square. Now I'm going to grab a red. Now when I painted that wet square next to another wet square, see how the bleeding happens in between the two colors? It can be unpredictable, but as long as I let one square dry first, then I'll have a nice clean sharp edge. Again, patience is key. Now I can use this in reverse. I can intentionally put wet things next to wet things to help me blend colors together. So I'm putting a green and a teal side by side, kind of going back and forth again while it's damp, and I'm using the water to help me blend the colors together. So again, if you can learn to control the water and how damp the paint is, you'll have wonderful results. Now, this technique's called dry brushing. This is where I use very little water on my brush and I pick up that natural texture of the paper. Lastly, here's an example of how rich and dark watercolor can get. It's not all pastels. Let's set up to do a small painting. I'm going to be using watercolor paper, which is thicker than computer paper to support the weight of the water. And next, I need a small drawing to paint. I've done a small drawing of a bird and I've added washi tape around the edges to help maintain a clean border. And first, I'm going to start with my lightest colors, beginning with yellow on the body of the bird. And I put a thin layer of water down first, and this is ensuring that that yellow dries with a nice, clean, even wash. Again, you can use a thin layer of water to help the paint spread exactly where you want it to go. So let's talk a little about the properties of this paint. Watercolors are water-based, meaning I use water to work with them and to rinse my brushes. They are transparent, meaning I can see the paper through the paint. I can re-wet part of the painting to rework it. So even if I make a mistake, it's fine because I can just get my brush damp, kind of rework that area. I can lift my mistakes, meaning I use a clean damp brush to lightly touch the surface and then dab with the clean paper towel, and it's going to lift away unwanted color. And also, this has a very quick dry time. Watercolor paints are dry within minutes. But again, watercolor is extremely forgiving to beginners because I can just re-wet the surface and continue to work with the paint. Now noticing I'm mixing a very dark brown by mixing brown and black in the lid because I'm going to make some of that area where the bird is standing. but I don't want to use that dirty paint water. So I'm going to make sure I keep clean water on hand. Otherwise, that dirty paint water is going to affect all the other colors that I want to paint with. All right, so I'm adding just a layer of water in the background. This is going to help me do a gradual wash with a beautiful blue and help it fade from a light blue to a dark blue. And I want the surface of that paper to stay wet while I'm working with it. You'll see I'm actually using a combination of pan and tube colors and just working my way down. And one of the beautiful things about watercolor is it's not always super predictable. So I don't know exactly how this fade is going to look until I see the water kind of work and move and manipulate the paint. But I really like these slightly unpredictable results. In this case, it's turning out pretty beautiful. And because I let the body of the bird thoroughly dry before I started painting the background, I'm not going to have any bleeding between the bird and the background. So you'll see I'm mixing several colors to make a custom beak color. Again, I'm just kind of using a clean dry brush to clean up the edge of that beak. I did have a little bit of bleeding. The background wasn't quite dry enough yet. And I'm coming in with a smaller pointier brush to add in some of those small details, such as the eye and the feathers on the back of the bird. Now, once this painting is finished, I want to be careful that I don't walk out into the rain with it, because once it gets water on it again, the paint will start moving. So once this piece is finished, it really needs to go behind a frame to keep it protected. So largely, watercolors are very inexpensive. They're portable, they're easy to work with, but you do need to have water on hand to make them work, and the ability to change and clean your water frequently. And once the piece is done, it really does need to be framed. So you can see I'm coming back with this fine detail brush and just adding some little tiny feathered details to the bird. But at this point, he looks kind of flat. So I'm going to come back in again with that small detail brush, and I'm going to add just more teeny tiny things to this piece. I'm going to add a darker red up on the head of the bird and kind of blend that in with the red layer that I already put down. And again, this is a great paint to work with in layers because of the transparency, which means those early layers of paint are going to show through. This is called a glazing, when you put one color on top of another to create a third brand new color. And again, by glazing and layering, it's just making this bird look a little more three-dimensional. Again, I'm using a paper towel while the surface is wet to kind of dab at the surface and get exactly the values that I want. So I'm going to add some shadowy tones around the bottom of the bird, just to make him look slightly more three-dimensional. And watercolors are great. There's a lot you can do and add to the paint to make it work in different ways. Like if I sprinkled a little salt down, it would create almost a frost-like effect on the surface. Or if I dabbed at the surface with plastic wrap, it would create an interesting texture. So you can feel free to watch my watercolor technique tutorial video for more ways to manipulate watercolor paints. And finally, my favorite part, which is to gently peel away the washi tape, revealing a clean border. The tape served as a mask, masking the paint from the border of the piece. And there you have it, a small example of a watercolor bird. I can't wait for you to try this at home. Next up, acrylic paints. So there are a few different kinds of acrylic paints. The kind that come in bottles from the craft store, these usually cost around $1. And I'm just going to put a little out on my palette. I like to use styrofoam plates, although you can use a plastic palette tray if you prefer. And this kind is a heavy body tube, and this is from a fine art store. This is going to cost a few more dollars. And we'll put that out too. Now both of these are examples of scarlet, so you can really see the difference. Now, when I painted with the watercolors, it was a lot like painting with grape juice, but when you paint with acrylics, it's more like painting with yogurt. It's gonna be a little thicker. So there's the dollar tube paint. And notice I am working with water, but only to rinse my brush. I want a dry brush when I'm painting. Here's the heavy body tube. You'll notice the slightly more expensive tube paint has slightly better results in quality. It's going to be more opaque, a little creamier to put down. You're going to get slightly better results. And that's really the difference between craft paint and fine art acrylic paint. All right, for this piece, I'm going to be working on something called Canva paper. It has the texture of canvas, but instead of being actual canvas, it's paper. So first, I need a drawing. All right, so to set up for this painting, I'm gonna need to get out a bunch of colors of paint that go along with my reference photo. And my preference is to arrange my palette in color order, or from lightest to darkest, whatever makes more sense with the piece that you're working on. So at this point, I've added a lot of my greens and blues all the way down to black. And then I'm gonna add yellow and white on the other end of my piece. And I can tell you, you never have enough white paint. You're always gonna go through it so much faster. All right, so I've got a couple different brushes to work with, a couple different size round brushes. Now, unlike watercolor, I'm not working with the wet brush, I'm working with a dry brush. And you can see on my palette, I'm using the toe of my brush to grab a little of each color as I need it. And unlike watercolor, where the paint was transparent, this paint is opaque, which means if I want a lighter color, I have to mix in white paint. Unlike watercolors, where if I want a lighter color, I add more water, allowing the white of the paper to show through. That's one of the key differences between watercolors and acrylics. Let's talk more about the similarities and differences between watercolors and acrylics. Both paints are relatively inexpensive and water-based, although with watercolors, you use water to activate and manipulate the paint. With acrylics, you only use water to change colors on your brush. You want to keep your brush dry as you work with the paint. Watercolors and acrylics both take just a few minutes to dry, but they behave differently when you make mistakes. When I make a mistake with watercolor, I have to re-wet the surface, dab with a paper towel, and lift that mistake away. With acrylics, if I make a mistake, I'm going to allow the paint to dry and then simply paint over it. Because of the opacity of the paint, I won't see the mistake underneath. Watercolors tend to work best on watercolor paper. Meanwhile, acrylic paint can work on a much wider variety of surfaces. I can work on watercolor paper, illustration board, Canva paper, wood, fabric, and many other surfaces. It's a very versatile paint. Once this painting is finished and dry, I can get it wet, and it's no problem. The painting and the paint is not going anywhere. While I do recommend framing your finished acrylic pieces, you don't have to. So at this point, I'm just coming in and I'm starting to build up the body of this bird. And I'm mixing some lighter values of blue on my palette. I'm just adding more layers. It's easy to blend the paint while it's wet on the surface. Once it's dry, it's considerably more challenging. It's difficult to blend acrylic paints if you're working on a large scale. Luckily for us, this is a very small piece and it's being very cooperative. So I'm starting to pull in some of my darker values, some of those deeper blues. And again, rinsing my brush in between and wiping it dry on that paper towel. So let's take a quick peek at the history of acrylic paints, because compared to watercolor paints and oil paints, these are very new. While some artists began using acrylics in the 1920s and 30s to work on murals, It wasn't until the early 1950s that acrylic paint became commercially available. It has greatly increased in its popularity since that point. Compared to most other paints, it's very non-toxic and easy to work with, and you can cover large surfaces in bright, bold colors. So you'll see I've switched to a fine detail brush, and I'm starting to come in and do some of those smaller areas such as the beak. And unlike watercolors, I don't have to worry about bleeding because I can put wet paint next to wet paint with acrylic and nothing happens. The paint only goes where your brush puts the paint down, which again has its advantages and disadvantages. You need to have a steady hand and work with the right kind of paint brushes. And I'm using a small round tip brush. And I'm just coming into the back of the bird and kind of adding in some of those textures and details. Now watercolor is very thin and flat, but acrylics, you can really build up the body of the paint. Now I'm painting fairly smooth, flat shapes, but I could use this paint with a palette knife or mix in an acrylic medium that would make the paint act a little thicker than it normally would, and it would leave a visible texture on the surface. And while this would take slightly longer to dry, it's still a very versatile medium. You can use it thin like watercolors or thick like oils, however you want to. Again, just trying to add contrast to this bird. And a little more dimension to the bottom of him in the shape. If I make a mistake, I can just simply wait till he's dry and then add more paint on top. So here you'll see me starting to blend some different blue tones together. This bird has a lot of very specific warm and cool blue tones. He's got some cooler blues on his little feet holding onto this branch. I'm going to come back, add a little black to darken up the value of my blue. I'm going to add this to kind of the bottom side of each of his little toes. I want his feet to look slightly more three-dimensional. And having a light source instantly makes everything more 3D. So I'm working on the branch that our little bird is standing on. He's got a little reflected color, some reflected blues kind of bouncing off his body onto the branch. So mixing browns and blues together. And that branch is going to go darker as it rolls around towards the bottom of the branch. Again, we want the branch to feel as three-dimensional as the body of the bird. And I love paintings like this because it gives me so many unique opportunities to do color mixing on my palette and not just work straight from the tube. You may not always have the exact color that you need. You might be only working with the primary palette, meaning red, yellow, and blue, and you'll have to custom mix all of your colors. So for a lot of these browns, I'm not just using straight out of the tube brown paint, but I'm mixing in white, black, even a little blue. In the background, I've made a custom gray, and this gray is really going to allow the bright, beautiful colors of the bird to pop and push him to the foreground of the piece. And so I've switched to a flathead brush, which means that instead of being round and pointy, it's kind of flat and thin and has a squared off toe. And I like using flat brushes for stuff like this because that nice hard line edge really gives me a lot of control as I contour around shapes. And at this point, I'm just being fussy and I'm coming back and evening out some of those backgrounds, kind of adjusting values, seeing what I like the best. And again, just tweaking the values. I want that branch to really stand out from the background and pop forward. I'm coming back and adding a few little details to the bird's body. More details and texture around the face. A little blending around those yellow feathers. I want the bottom of his body to feel a little more round, so I'm working in some darker values. And again, all of these little changes are going to help him feel more three-dimensional and realistic. My last step is to peel off the washi tape, and there's my finished piece. Last but not least is oil paint, my personal favorite. We'll need a set of oil paints, a palette, some linseed oil, which is a main component of oil paint, and a silicoil jar. A silicoil jar is filled with solvent. So anytime I want to switch paint colors, I'm going to take my dirty paintbrush, push down on the coil inside the jar, loading the paintbrush with paint thinner, scraping the bristles across the coils, and therefore all of the dirty paint will sink down to the bottom of the jar, leaving my brush clean. And this time we are also going to be working on Canva paper for this example. So now that we have our drawing, we're going to set up our paint palette in a very similar way that we set up our acrylic palette. We'll put out our colors in color order. You'll notice these paints in general look darker, but they're very concentrated pigments. And anytime I add white or a lighter color of oil paint to them, they'll all brighten up quite a bit. So I kind of saved the right side of my palette for my cool tones and the left side for those warm tones. And a little oil paint goes a long way. So these are my oil painting brushes. They are used only with my oil paints. I do not use them with watercolor or acrylic because again, once a brush is used with an oil-based paint, it doesn't exactly react the same as it would if you dipped it back in water-based paints. Now, if watercolors were like grape juice and acrylics were like yogurt, oils are best compared to peanut butter. They are very thick and creamy. Now, the big difference with oil paint is the dry time. Where my watercolors and acrylic paints would be dry within minutes, my oil paint will take days to dry. And you can see on the surface it has a very visible thickness to the paint. Now you may think, well, why would I want the paint to take so long to dry? That seems terrible. But it's not. It's a wonderful advantage because I can go back and blend and blend and blend. This is why it's one of my favorite paints to work with. Now these paints have been around a long time, all the way back to 650 AD, but they didn't get very popular until the 15th and 16th century. By the time we rolled around to the Renaissance, oil paints were all the rage. So you can see I'm pulling from several different blues and mixing some custom blue tones for my bird's little body. And I like to bounce back and forth between a flathead brush and a filbert brush. And a filbert is very similar to a flat top, except the shape of the top of the brush looks more like your fingernail. It's got a slight curve to it. So right now I'm using a small flat head to apply some of those blues. And every now and again I'm wiping the paintbrush on the paper towel to just get some of the bulk of that paint off. I want the tip of my brush to be very sharp and pointy so I continue with those small details. And notice, no water in sight. That's the biggest difference between oil paint and watercolor and acrylics. This is an oil-based paint, not water-based. Although, like acrylics, it is opaque. I cannot see the white of the paper or canvas through the paint. And compared to the other two, this would be considered the most expensive. Although I've gotten sets of paints for reasonable amounts of money. If you buy tubes individually or in larger sizes, it can get pretty expensive. But that just means that the value of this little bird is going to be higher than the other two, and I could sell it for more money because it cost more to produce it. So traditionally, artists who work with oil paints will be painting on canvas, kind of propped upright on an easel, but in my demonstration I'm using Canva paper, which mimics the surface of canvas. And because it's so small, I am working flat. So you can see I want to change colors, so I'm getting the tip of the brush wet with paint thinner, scraping it off. Notice I'm putting the lid immediately back on the jar. Compared to the other two paints, this one is the most toxic, which means I have the most opportunities to do harm to myself using this paint. So my students always laugh at me when I say this, but the number one rule of oil painting is you do not eat paint. Do not put any paint in your mouth. And it always surprised me in art school. I would see my friends come to art class and we would set up to do an oil painting, and my friends would take a break, have some cookies, or eat some potato chips, and they still had paint on their hands and they ended up with paint in their mouths. Or they wouldn't put the lid on their silicoil jar, and instead of rinsing their paintbrush in their silicoil jar, they would rinse in their coffee cup and then drink the coffee. So you have to be cautious that you're not getting paint into your mouth, into your body. Also, that paint thinner is very toxic. I've seen friends accidentally grab the silicoil jar to go to sip out of it thinking it was their coffee cup. And that's not good either. It's also not good to breathe in paint thinner for any amount of time, which means I'm always got my lid on my jar nice and tight. I'm also working in a well-ventilated area. I have a window next to me that's cracked. I have a ceiling fan going, and I'm being very aware of my surroundings. Sometimes if you're in a small studio and the window's closed, you don't have ventilation, you've been painting for hours, you'll start noticing you're getting a headache from the fumes of those oil paints. So you just have to be careful that you're working smarter, not harder. Work in a safe, well-ventilated area, and make sure you're taking frequent breaks. And again, you're washing your hands frequently. You don't want a lot of paint on your hands, especially if you're gonna take a break and go have a snack. So as I work on this background, I'm doing a little artist trick, which in order to make the birds stand out more, I'm putting the contrasting value behind the bird. So the bird's back is almost black, so I'm putting a lighter value background behind that part of the bird. But around his head, his feathers are very light, so the background is going a little darker. And again, these subtle changes are helping to push the bird further into our foreground and make him look more 3D. So again, darkening the background around his chest. And finally, just pulling off that washi tape, nice clean finish. And there you go. Whether you're working with watercolor paint, acrylic paint, or oil paint. I hope this tutorial has helped show you some of the key similarities and differences. This has been Art with Mrs. Bibb.